first.
TCU made it to the national title game last year, but there is a distinction, and we talk about it on the show all the time, between super teams and developmental or non-super teams. And people think that super teams means how good they are or what the spread of the game is or any other way that you can kind of look at the two teams before they play. But all super teams are for the psychos like us and the people listening to the show who pay deep and close attention to talent accumulation out of the high school ranks and the teams that have been able to accumulate the most. It's been an embarrassment of riches for 3 or 4 programs over the course of the past 10 years. Alabama, for instance, had 18 5-star prospects on their roster, and Michigan had 2. So even though Michigan was favored, for our purposes, the super team was Alabama. And Michigan was favored to beat Ohio State. They did. Ohio State, based on the way that they've recruited, is the super team. So when I say super teams, we're talking about the recruiting juggernauts that have so many good players they don't even know what to do with them and have for the last 20 years won the national championships in a very consistent rate, especially in the CFP era. So I think it's possible to get somewhere, but my contention with the possibility of getting somewhere is that eventually you're going to have to face a team that is built that way athletically from a recruiting standpoint. Washington, funny enough, could win a national championship this year and never have to beat any of them. They never played any of them. They beat Oregon twice, very impressive. They beat Texas, who was a fringe, Group A team or super team, and they would beat Michigan. I'm not saying they wouldn't be deserving of the national title, but usually there's a big, bad Georgia or Alabama or Ohio State waiting at the end of the line for those teams that are the Cinderellas. And I was always of the mindset that if your team is not built that way, you simply cannot win a national championship because your team will falter when you play a team that, much like TCU season ended a year ago. They were a very good football team, a developmental program. They did well in the portal. They played Georgia, and Georgia dropped 60. I didn't think it was going to be that dramatic, but my thought process coming into the playoff is that in these settings, the cream rises to the top. The teams that are athletically superior from a recruiting standpoint usually win. Nothing happened on Monday. It was terribly surprising, I guess. But my picks were Texas and Alabama to play for the championship for those reasons. So because Michigan was able to beat both Ohio State and Alabama in 2 of 3 games, they have accomplished something that I did not think was physically possible. And I use the word physically intentionally. Physically, in the game, from a physical standpoint, did not think they could do it. I was wrong. They are able to win a national championship. And moving forward, I can no longer say it's impossible. It's never happened yet before. It's happened now.
Manny, thoughts on the games and kind of thoughts on Ari's kind of black and white stance? Like either you can or you can't.
Yeah, I mean, look, I picked Alabama and Texas to win too for the same reasons. I agreed with Ari's assessment pregame and on our show last week, where we sat there and we broke down the rosters and we counted 5 stars and 4 stars and did the whole talent thing. But one thing that I told Ari, and I think most people agree, is that the COVID year has thrown everything off. And I think while this may be one of those unique situations where it was sort of the perfect storm, both of those games were extremely close. Okay. I mean, overtime, Texas had a chance to win it. They were 10 yards away, taking shot at the end zone. It's almost like a special circumstance. I think in the future going forward, especially when we go to the 12-team playoff, it is going to be a lot harder for Cinderella to win 3 games, right? Like somebody to just sneak in the back end and be one of those 8 to 12 teams, right? And go on a run where they can beat Ohio State, Alabama, or Georgia in a row and win the national title. I just think it's going to be a lot tougher. And I think ultimately when we get rid of the COVID year and there are fewer 6th and 7th year guys in the years ahead, that advantage that Michigan and Washington clearly took advantage of at certain positions like quarterback with Michael Penix, and Michigan with guys that are in their 6th year as well on their defense. It's just not going to be there. And I think ultimately talent will win out. So I still believe in the Stars Matter mantra. I just think this year was the exception.
Grace?
I agree with basically everything you guys just said. I mean, I also did all 4 of us pick Alabama and Texas?
We host a podcast called Stars Matter. Yeah.
Okay. So I went back. I almost picked I almost picked Washington, but I talked myself out of it. But yeah, I think the portal's a big part of this. To your point, Manny, development when you've got 5th and 6th year guys. I thought Michigan up front was probably the most impressive thing I saw in either one of those games on Monday. Just the way that their defensive line dominated Alabama, I thought was a huge difference maker. But yeah, I mean, I don't know that I view it super black and white. Like, I still think that the most talented teams are going to win the most, but I don't think it's impossible. And I don't know. It's just hard. And that's why I think we like Kalen DeBoer so much, is because what he's doing is unique. It's hard. It's tough.
Yeah. And I've said this before, that we've seen quick turnarounds, but from a Washington program that literally like 2 years and now a month lost at home to Washington State and had Washington State fans storm the field in Seattle after winning like 41-19, and just a low moment for that program, to 2 years later to be playing for the national championship. Just an unbelievable job by Kalen DeBoer in that staff. And, give him credit for, we hear this cliche all the time, re-recruiting guys when new coaches took over. Well, they re-recruited a lot of those guys, Jalen McMillan, Romo Dunze, and all the cliches you want to use, bought in. And then, when you've got guys coming back for their 5th, 6th, and 7th year, it's because they believe, in the coach and the coaching staff. So just really good job by that staff, obviously.
Well, here's the question. Can I ask this question to the three of you?
Of course.
And the thing that I've struggled with this is that there are a lot of interesting circumstances that came and played into the season. One, obviously, is that you have a bunch of 6-year players from the COVID year. You have a bunch of guys who are older, more experienced. And Manny, you did so much research and figured out that Michigan had in their 2 deep 3,000 snaps more experience than Alabama and playing time.
Oh, Ari, I thought you looked that up yourself.
No, I don't even know where you find snap counts. Manny, great work.
Yeah.
But you have that factor to it. You have the transfer portal factor into it. And then you also have the factor of, Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama also, all three were not great this year. And Georgia, I think, was probably the best of the three. They ended up losing to Alabama, but they weren't all peak versions of themselves. They didn't have the team that they had a year ago. So how many times moving forward with the way that those teams recruit are you going to get a season in which all three of the biggest recruiting monsters in the sport, and we don't even know, I don't even know what happened to Clemson. They weren't even a factor in it this year. But the teams that we have grown to expect to be physically superior are going to all be down at the same time. So the question that I have is this a 1-year fluke or a 1-year scenario where the teams just all were more evenly matched because quarterback play, all three of those places were, replacing quarterbacks and weren't like, think about like if Michigan had to play 2019 LSU or 2020 Alabama, there were no teams like that in the sport this year. Or is it going to be every other year where there are teams that are in the 12 to 26 range in the 247 Sports Composite that are playing for a national championship? I think it's going to be harder in the 12-team field, but more teams are going to get to play in it. It's a very interesting dynamic because now it's no longer impossible that a team like Washington, who ranks 26 in that ranking, could win a national championship, but it also seems still crazy to think that a team like Ole Miss or Arizona or any of the other 15 teams that I would have automatically disqualified from CFP contention this year being alive next year. Like, what do you guys think? Is it 1 year or is this the new norm?
Two things on that. And I want to credit our friend Bill Landis for this text. For this,
Udalaby?
Yes, he sent this text to me a couple weeks ago.
That you blew off?
Yeah, totally. And Georgia's average player rating is the lowest number one average player rating since 2020 and the third lowest of the last decade. 19 teams have an average player rating in this class of 90 or better. That's the most to meet that threshold in the last 10 years. The average number of teams with an average player rating of 90 or better in the previous 9 cycles was 12. So sort of Ari's point,
what did he respond? What did you respond to that?
I said, good stuff, thanks. And then he did not respond. And then
what is he supposed to say to that? You blew him off.
Then I said, great stat. Thanks for sharing. Appreciate it, with 5 exclamation points a week later. And he said, that's the kind of enthusiasm we're looking for. So, so Ari, you bring the point up well, Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia weren't great this year. Well, maybe we are seeing the trend where the super
Mhm.
teams aren't quite so super, which we all want to see. But I want to bring something else out, and Ari's Mr. Ohio State, so he needs to answer this, but I want everyone's thoughts on this. At what point do we not consider Ohio State a super team? I know their recruiting rankings say they are, Ari, and we've talked about this. When their recruiting rankings are carried to the elite status by a bunch of players at the same position, and we're seeing those guys transfer, their roster, the overall strength of their roster at the key positions, the offensive, defensive lines, does not match their recruiting rankings because they're positional heavy. If that's not the best way to say it. But so I think Georgia and Alabama are now in a different tier. And while Ohio State, the numbers might say they're close, I don't think they are from the super team status.
Well, I'm going to do old dad one better, and I'm going to throw this right back at you. You know, it's like a ping pong match. Alabama is the most or the second most talented team on paper in the history of the sport this year, in the history of us tracking stars. The second most, so more than 2019 LSU, more than 2020 Alabama, more than the Clemson teams, all of the best teams that won national championships. This team has more raw talent on it. And yet somehow it had deficiencies at wide receiver. It had an offensive lineman that couldn't snap the ball they were unable to replace. The running back is pretty good, but not great. Why does Alabama have 5 holes on their roster when the whole point of this talent accumulation is supposed to eliminate those problems? You're not supposed to have a single hole. We're talking about an Alabama team that once had TJ Yeldon, Alvin Kamara, and Derrick Henry in the same backfield. We're talking about a team that signed Henry Ruggs, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Waddle in the same recruiting class. That's a super team. So my question back to you, because I think that the talent distribution on your roster is clearly important, and I think everything you're saying is true. In the past, I've just taken the accumulation of total talent and assumed that it'll bear out because the wealth and the difference of those players was so drastic that it didn't matter. But now it's clearly starting to matter more, to the point where the second most talented team on paper in recruiting world this year had 3 offensive position groups that were questionable. That to me is like, how did that happen? That makes no sense. They didn't even have a backup offensive lineman to put in there to snap the ball properly. If Alabama had one more backup offensive lineman who could snap the ball properly, they would have won the game. And I'm not talking about the final play. I'm talking about the entirety of that football game.